Up to date throughout the day by visiting our website gbnews.com.
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. 2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome to Lee Anderson's Real World. Got a cracking lineup tonight. We've got Greg Svensson. Vince Cable, he's back on the show. Christine Hamilton, she's on the show for the second time. YouTube sensation Pearl Davis on the show for the first time. And Beatles biographer Philip Norman. But first, let's go to the news.
Very good evening from the GB newsroom. Just gone 7 o'clock, I'm Sam Francis, and we start with news from Northern Ireland, where the new leader of the Democratic Unionist Party has tonight condemned what he calls conspiracy theories and cheap political point scoring following criminal charges brought against Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. The departure of the DUP's former leader and longest-serving MP in Northern Ireland came after he was accused of serious historical sexual offences. A 57-year-old woman has also been charged with aiding and abetting additional offences in relation to that same police investigation. Well, Gavin Robertson was unanimously appointed as the interim leader of the DUP after Sir Geoffrey's shock resignation today. He says the charges against Donaldson have been devastating.
I think it's caused tremendous shock, not just for myself personally or my colleagues within the DUP, but for the community right across Northern Ireland. It came as a great shock. But we are a party and individuals that believe in justice. We have faith in our criminal justice system. And so in the coming days and months, I think it is important that none of us say anything or act in any way that would seek to prejudice what is now an ongoing criminal investigation.
In other news, one of the Conservative Party's major donors has received a knighthood as part of a controversial honours list from Rishi Sunak. Mohamed Mansour gave £5 million to the Tories last year and is a senior treasurer for the party. He was knighted for what's described as services to business, to charity and politics. Other recipients include MP Philip Davies, who's also a former presenter on this network. And the timing of the list is unusual, though, coming while Parliament is in recess and on the eve of the Easter bank holiday weekend. Police are appealing for help in their search for a man suspected of raping 2 women in London. The attacks took place 4 years apart, first in Westminster in 2018, followed by another incident in Shoreditch in 2022. Those offences were being investigated as separate crimes, but forensic work has now helped to draw a link between the two. Detectives say it's highly likely the suspect has also committed other attacks. The Metropolitan Police has released this e-fit image you can see there if you're watching on television, and they're asking anyone who may have information to contact police or call Crime Stoppers. And finally, before heading back to Lee, soldiers and officers in the British Army are now allowed to grow beards after a century-old rule has been overturned. The changes come after an official review of the military's appearance policy. Under the new rules, beards and moustaches must be groomed, kept within a specific length, and have routine checks. The Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has praised the shift in culture, saying that it's important the military keeps up with modern standards. Those are the headlines. I'll be back at 8 o'clock. In the meantime, you can sign up to GB News Alerts. Just scan the code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, though, it's back to Lee.
Welcome to Lee Anderson's Real World, and tonight we're going to be talking about Donald Trump and what it will mean for the rest of the world and Britain if he gets elected this year. Joining for the first time on the show is Greg Svensson. You're the Overseas Republican...
Chairman of Republicans Overseas
That's
UK.
Him. That's a mouthful. And back as left in the corner, we've got Sir Vince Cable, who is the former leader of Liberal Democrats. So this year, Greg, you know, it's a big time for Americans, your native country. There's going to be an election. I sort of think that Donald Trump's going to win. I think most people over here think Trump's going to win. What will it mean for the UK and the rest of the world, and in particular Ukraine?
Well, it does look like he's going to win. If the election was tomorrow, he surely would win. And I think it's good news for the UK, it's good news for the world, and probably good news for Ukraine, because I don't think President Trump is as opposed to it as his opponents try to make it out, you know, make it look like. So he's just he's a transactional president. He'll want to see, like most people in America, want to see the border in the U.S., the U.S.-Mexico border. They want to see that taken care of. Yeah. And they're quite related. They're both national security issues, so you can't really segregate the two. Granted, they're, you know, thousands of miles apart, but I think that Americans, and especially Congress people going back to their districts, they can't go back and expect to be re-elected if they've sent $60 billion.
When Trump got first elected, he made a big song and dance about controlling the borders. I think he sort of did that, but since he's left office, it's got worse, surely.
Absolutely. Biden just flipped a switch on day one. In January of 21, he basically executed executive orders to reverse all of the Trump policies that were working. It was the lowest illegal immigration in 45 years. Wow. And so we went from 500,000 illegal migrants a year to 2.5 million under Biden. It's an utter disaster. It's a humanitarian disaster, too. So I think, you know, Trump will want to see that fixed, and I think most people in Congress are happy to send the $60 billion to Ukraine, but they need to have that border fixed first.
Sir Vince, will the world be a better place if Donald Trump gets elected in November this year?
Well, certainly not, but I do agree he may well be elected. I think the biggest disaster is potentially Ukraine. I mean, Trump supporters are blocking help when the Ukrainians desperately need it, and, you know, tens of thousands of Ukrainians are being killed, you know, defending their country, defending freedom. Trump's made it very clear he wants a quick settlement with the Russians on the Russians' terms. Now, that would be an unmitigated disaster, I think. Secondly, the threat to impose tariffs, not just on countries that they might see as adversaries like China, but on the Western world as well, gumming up the world trading system, creating the kind of protectionist warfare we had in the 1930s. That would be a disaster. And I think the mere fact that somebody could come into power having refused to accept a democratic election, a bad loser, challenging the whole basis of democratic election, will do terrible damage to the credibility of our values in the West.
So, Greg, is Sir Vince, is he misguided, or he seems to be fearful of a Trump administration? We heard all this many years ago when he first got elected, that there was going to be Third World War, nuclear wars, and it never happened.
And if anything, his foreign policy successes were some of the greatest of his administration. Yes, the economy was so much better, and I think people miss that. They might not miss Donald Trump and the unfiltered rhetoric, but they do miss 2019 or 2020.
But Sir Vince is right with the amount of people that's getting killed in Ukraine. It's tens of thousands, literally. We need to put a stop to that, don't we?
And I think President Trump would do a much better job of that, right? Well, I mean, he's transactional, so I think he'll go in and force Putin to negotiate somehow. I don't know. He doesn't really dictate that answer. But speaking of national security, I mean, the UK and Europe in general will be better off with Trump because he would actually build up the military, whereas Biden, in a very difficult time, he's cut defense spending. It's so counterintuitive. You know, you have many NATO countries that are increasing the amount of money they spend, whereas a percentage of GDP anyway. So you've gone from, in many ways, thanks to Trump, you've gone from 5 countries meeting the 2% target to 11. That's going to 18 this year, whereas the U.S. defense budget is being cut in real terms by 3%. That's a disaster, and I think that if President Trump is back in office, you'll see a stronger American military, which is good for the UK, our allies, as well as good for Europe.
Sir Vince, if you was an American citizen right now, living in the States, and we've got this election coming up, would you vote for Biden, and why would you vote for Biden?
Well, I would vote for him, perhaps reluctantly. I mean, I think another younger, forward-looking Democratic candidate would be much more appealing, but I would certainly vote for him. I do agree on the specific point that, you know, other NATO countries have got to get to the mark. You know, Germany, France, Italy have got to pay their dues. I do agree with that. But threatening that you'd be perfectly happy to invite the Russians in, I mean, it may have been intended as a joke, but it was taken seriously and completely undermines the sense that you have to have a security alliance. And what Biden has been very good at, whatever the failings, what he's been very good at is building up a sense that you're working as an alliance with other countries with the same values.
He wasn't very good with Afghanistan, was he?
No, but actually Trump had negotiated with the Taliban and had created the conditions under which American remaining was impossible. I mean, basically, Biden had to carry the can for what his predecessors had done.
Greg, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, in retrospect, I mean, utter failure, obviously, from Biden. Yes, President Trump wanted to have an exit from Afghanistan, but as the senior military officials in the DOD they recommended 2,500 to 5,000 troops remain. That was the policy of Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump when Pompeo was Secretary of State, and they actually recommended that to Biden. And he ignored their recommendation, pulled everybody out. Look at the disaster that happened. So his numbers went down because of Afghanistan, but they haven't recovered. So it's been a complete failure of an administration.
Vince, it's looking likely that later this year we're going to have Trump in charge of America and possibly Starmer running the UK as a Prime Minister. Is that going to be a good relationship, do you think?
Well, I think Starmer, I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but I think seems to be a professional, low-key kind of guy, not very exciting, but business-like, and will try to make the relationship work. And they may make it very difficult. I mean, if you remember, you know, Trump humiliated Theresa May. I mean, she was, you know, trying to be workmanlike, build a relationship with America, and Trump humiliated her. And I hope that he doesn't do the same with the next British Prime Minister.
But wasn't Trump humiliated when he came to London? They had this big balloon flying over the Thames, I think.
He obviously doesn't poll well in the United Kingdom, but
I don't know about that, Greg. I mean, he probably doesn't poll well in Westminster. In Westminster, but come to my neck of the woods and he'd have some big lots of support.
Absolutely, and it's very similar in America. He doesn't do well in the salons of Georgetown or the Upper East Side of Manhattan, but he does really well in the rest of the country, inside of the coast. So, but I think if you look back, I think he got along much better with Theresa May than Vince is suggesting. And when Biden took over, you had the immediate, I wouldn't call it insults, but he surely didn't reach out to the UK like Trump had. You know, he was very pro-EU, pro-Ireland. He had very uncomfortable relationships and with our allies, right out of the gates, the Saudis, the UK, Israel, it's continued. So for someone who was always saying, in 2020, America's back, adults back in the room, he's really not done well with U.S. allies, and yet he's really helped Iran make a hell of a lot more money in selling oil. He's put $60 billion and just released another $10 billion of money to fund the Iran's funding of their Shia satellites, and that's working for Iran. So it's odd that his foreign policy has been such a disaster, given that he campaigned on America's back and American leadership will be back. It's been quite the opposite. So I think you'll see a much better national security situation.
Okay. I'll give the final word to Vince. His foreign policy has been a disaster.
I'll just say one small positive thing in favour of Trump. He's been saying some fairly sensible things about the takeover of TikTok, going against the grain and trying to diffuse some of this complete paranoia about Chinese companies, which of course we also have here. So that's one up for him.
Well, look, it's a fascinating discussion, as always. Thanks for coming on the show, Greg. Thanks, Vince, once again, for coming on the show. Look, do not go away, because coming up next, we've got Back in the Day with Beatles biographer Philip Norman.
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, a TV exclusive with former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, and he is scathing about Rishi Sunak.
Would you try to talk about legal immigration and it was just battered away? Yes.
And sexual assaults are taking place in migrant hotels.
I did see some very concerning incidents, for example, at the asylum hotels, individuals committing sexual assault.
Also, find out why Queers for Palestine want us to boycott Eurovision, and is Ramadan more popular than Easter? Don't miss Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. Be there.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Men's mental health.
Yeah.
Men are starting to talk a lot more.
Yeah.
You've been through a lot of stuff that people don't know about.
Yeah, the last few years for me have been very, very difficult. People see me on tour, performing, making music, but myself and my wife, we went through 2 miscarriages.
Oh.
And for us, that was a very devastating time and very difficult to know how to kind of process those emotions. And I guess as a man, I did the thing of bottling up my emotions, and where I feel comfortable to be able to express myself is in the studio, whereas, she had obviously a different reaction to, what happened to us, because not only was it happening to her mentally, psychologically, but it was happening to her physically as well. And I think something that she really wanted to see from me was that sensitivity and that emotion. And I thought that as a man, being strong was trying to bottle up my emotions and just show her that, that I'm being strong for her. But actually being strong is talking about it. And what's happened ever since I've started to talk about it is I've spoken to more men that have experienced baby loss. My wife forced out of me, how do you feel? And I ended up as a mess on the floor. I was exasperating, crying, almost inconsolable. She was just holding me in her arms as we cried together, and we cried together. And I didn't realise I needed that release so badly. Like I said, I've been able to speak to other men, and we've been able to cry together, and they shared their own experiences, which they did similar to me. But actually, as men, I feel like that conversation and that sensitivity and being able to be emotional together.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
I'm Andrew Doyle.
Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Lee Anderson's Real World today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Philip Norman, who's a biographer. You've written books on the Beatles, Buddy Holly, John Lennon, and you've got a book out at the moment. What's that called?
George Harrison, The Reluctant Beatle.
Yeah.
So that makes 3 out of 4.
Why was he reluctant?
He wasn't a reluctant musician because he taught himself to play the guitar at a very young age, 14.
Yeah.
So he looked still like a little kid when he was playing with John and Paul, but he hated the Beatlemania, the screaming that covered up his painstakingly crafted solos, and particularly in America when there was no security and the stage would be invaded by young women, actually hanging around his neck while he tried to play.
So you talked about America. I think the first time they went was what? Was it 64, 65?
February 64.
And they went on, was it the Ed Sullivan Show?
Yep. Ed Sullivan Show watched by 72 million people.
Wow.
There was no crime in New York throughout the duration of their appearance on Ed Sullivan. Not one single hubcap was stolen in the 5 boroughs. George had a temperature of 104 because he had a strep throat, but he still had to play.
Yeah, it's incredible, that is. Let's go a little bit further back in time from 1964. We spoke before, Philip. I'm a massive fan of people like Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, Elvis, and I guess the Beatles, they took a lot of inspiration. Everly Brothers as well is one for the harmonies, etc. They took a lot of inspiration and chucked it all together.
They did, but they added a little bit of Liverpool charm and wit and irreverence, and then sold it back to America, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
But no British act had ever done that in America before, and America went really crazy over them in the way it had never happened before with the British act, so, particularly as they were having their own music sold back to them by these kids.
See, the Beatles were great, the Stones were great, but I always blame the Beatles have got to take some responsibility for the Monkees coming over to the UK in the 60s.
Well, the Monkees were a knockoff American Beatles, but actually they did in the end learn to play their instruments. They couldn't at the beginning. They used to have musicians standing in the wings and they used to mime, but in the end they did learn to play, and they were actually quite good.
Yeah. So you wrote all these books, Philip, about some of my musical heroes as well. When did you actually first meet the Beatles?
I met them on what turned out to be their last British tour in 1965 in Newcastle on Tyne. I got into their dressing room, actually, and talked to John and Paul and Ringo, not George. George was a bit sort of standoffish. I never thought I'd be writing his biography one day. I was even allowed to hold Paul's bass guitar.
Wow.
Then I was thrown out by their roadie, Neil Aspinall, probably at a secret signal from them, which they had to get rid of people. I thought they loved me because they seemed so friendly, but they didn't.
So when you're writing these books about some of your pop heroes, how do you get close to them to get all the details and the facts right?
Well, it sort of accumulates over time. I did a book biography of the Beatles in the early 80s when people said, you're mad to do the Beatles. Everyone knows everything about them already. Of course, people didn't know. And then I went on to do the individual Beatles, getting more knowledge and more data as I went.
John Lennon. So obviously he went solo in the 70, 71, something like that. Had a brilliant music career after the Beatles, I think. Some of his later songs are absolutely phenomenal. And obviously, sad that I think it was 1980 when he got killed.
Well, that was it. I'd finished my book Shout, which was the biography of the Beatles. And I thought I might be getting across to see... They were all in denial. They had a terrible time, latterly, as the Beatles. I thought I still might get to meet John. And then the news came that he'd been assassinated, which was unbelievable at the time.
A big hero of the Beatles was Buddy Holly. And obviously he died, was it 1959, 58, something like that? Massive musical hero of mine. We spoke earlier about the apartment tapes in New York when he's just there strumming his guitar. And he wrote a biography on him as well.
I did. Well, in fact, he was very personal to me because my father actually ran a rock and roll dance at the end of a seaside pier. And I took up the guitar like a lot of people like Lennon and McCartney and... because Buddy Holly seemed to be teaching you how to play his songs. You could play his songs. You recognise the chords, not with Elvis, not with Scotty Moore, but with buddy, because he did play lead guitar as well as sing.
He did, and I think he was only 21, 22 when he actually died.
He was 22, and it's strange that you think of him as the father of rock and roll, but actually he was only 22.
Yeah, and so gifted and driven, and some of the songs he wrote, they stand the test of time, don't they?
They still sound as fresh as ever.
Yeah.
They were very adventurous, using double tracking electronic effects, you know. But it was a very, very short, and his career ended rather quickly in America, but carried on in Britain because he taught people like Lennon McCartney were like his pupils.
Yeah. So you've obviously got a passion for music, from the 50s and 60s. What about 70s music? I see on my list you're a bit of an Elton John fan as well.
Not really Elton John, because I used to think he ripped everyone off, really, him and Bernie Taupin, his lyricist.
Yeah.
But when I met Bernie, he said, yeah, of course we rip people off, but they didn't rip off the people I thought they had.
Yeah.
They didn't rip off Space Oddity. They ripped off another band called Pearls Before Swine.
Yeah.
But in the end, I did like Elton because he was just, you know, very straightforward and honest. But he went very much off the rails, of course, latterly. Yeah. Tried to be normal.
Yeah. So musical heroes present day, you know, we can go back to the 50s and 60s and early 70s. What about today's music? How has that changed, and who do you listen to?
The thing is that about music is there's always a tiny proportion of talent. People think the 60s were so brilliant, but there was a massive absolute rubbish recorded in the 60s as well. And today there is always 2% of talent. Someone like Amy Winehouse comes along, totally original, wonderful, obviously vulnerable in an awful way as well.
Yeah.
So there's always talent around.
Is there any musicians that you've met or any bands that were disappointing to you?
Yes, Aretha Franklin. I was listening to her on the car radio, terribly disappointed in Aretha Franklin. When I met Johnny Cash, I wanted him to be my dad. You know, he was so lovely.
But he had a troubled life as well, didn't he, Johnny Cash?
Not that bad, actually. No, he made more, really. He never really was in jail very much, you know. But then he started visiting jails because he thought he was an ex-con, but he wasn't really.
Yeah, so that's sort of played up to the crowd on that one. But he had a bad, drug habit as well, didn't he?
He did, yes. And because they all, you know, in the end, they were taking amphetamines to stay awake, like the Beatles, and that they got hooked on those. Yeah. But then he met this June Carter, who he married, his second wife, who was his redemption, really. And I went on the road with them together, and I love them both.
So just imagine, Philip, that you're down in the dumps one Sunday morning. You're going to put your CDs or your records on your record player. Which would be your go-to record?
It would be All Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix, I think. Wow. Which is because Jimmy's cover versions were as great as his original songs.
Yeah. Have you ever written about Jimi Hendrix?
I wrote a whole book about Jimi Hendrix.
Okay, and how's that one gone? Is it?
Yeah, it was a couple. That was my last one before George Harrison, and now I suppose I would be at risk of a cultural appropriation because he was African American. But he was a wonderful, very sweet, lovely character who, like a lot of them, died at the age of 27.
Yeah.
He was burnt out, really, by 27.
And I actually think he played in a club in Sutton, Ashfield, where I'm from, back in the 60s. In fact, we recorded one of our shows from that club, the Diamond Club. Just give them a plug while they watch it. Yeah, he actually performed there in the 1960s. I couldn't really get him, to be honest with you, Jimi Hendrix. I listened to some of the songs, and I just don't really get it. But the Beatles, the Stones.
The guitar playing is phenomenal.
Yeah.
I never thought you could top Jimi Hendrix until I heard Prince do a cover version of a George Harrison song.
Yeah.
And that was utterly even more brilliant than Hendrix.
Now, I can get into Prince. I can understand his music, his records. I like a bit of Prince, but he died tragically as well, didn't he?
He did. I mean, it seems to be almost like a condition of genius. You have to die young, except when you see the Stones, who are now national treasures.
Yeah.
And they were so notorious in the 60s. They were the most unstable band in the 60s, nearly went bust, and yet they turned into the long-lived Stones.
Do you think that's what it is, Philip, genius? Because they're always looking for that extra buzz, that they're always trying to push themselves, looking for something else. To get them out of bed in the morning.
It's also luck and timing, of course, and the Beatles really went to this right destination by all the wrong way, like going to Hamburg seemed disastrous at the time. But in the end, of course, they were at the right place at the right moment.
OK, well, thanks for that fascinating discussion. Thanks. Nice to meet you, Philip. Good luck with the George Harrison book. But coming up next, we've got Right versus Left with Christine Hamilton and Vince Cable.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast on the Met As we go through the rest of this Easter weekend, for most of us we've continued to see the mix of some sunshine but also the risk of some rain at times. It's all courtesy of this area low pressure which is going to hang around as we go through the next few days. But with winds coming up from the south, it should feel a little bit less cold. So as we end Good Friday, still the risk of some showers across parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, maybe western fringes of England and Wales, but elsewhere turning clear with the risk of a few misty patches forming come dawn and also a touch of frost in the countryside. So we do start Saturday off on a bit of a chilly note, but some sunshine from the word go. Risk of a little bit of cloud and patchy rain just reaching the very far east of England. And the main focus of any showers tomorrow will be, again, across more western and northern parts of the country. But there should be a little bit fewer and further between compared to today. Temperature-wise, in the sunshine, not feeling too bad. Highs reaching around 14 or 15 degrees. Having a look at Easter Day, a bit of a cloudy start across many eastern parts, but that will burn its way back towards the North Sea. So for many, again, it's another day of some sunny spells, risk of a few showers, potentially a little bit more in the way of persistent rain just arriving in the very far southwestern corner. And that sets us up for a bit of a north-south split on Monday. Rather grey and wet in the south, but hanging on to the sunshine further north.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQs live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQs live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Joining me now for Right versus Left is Christine Hamilton. Thanks for coming on, Christine. And Sir Vince Cable, former leader of the Liberal Democrats. We've got an election this year. In fact, we've got one in America, one in the UK. This show's been all about elections today. And we're looking
one in most of the Western world, haven't we? And half of the rest.
India.
And India, yes.
But we're looking at the media, guys, and how impartial they're going to be. Now, we know GB News is totally impartial. It's balanced. Indeed it is. Yes, and
Well, it does try hard. You know, there's always a left against anybody who's
well, let's talk
right.
about the taxpayer-funded BBC. Now, we know in the past that they've had to apologise for calling my party far right. I don't know where they got that idea from. They refused
Wishful thinking.
They refused to use the word terrorists when talking about Hamas. They say it's government calls them terrorists. It's a bit of a cop-out to me. Vince, are they going to be impartial, the BBC?
Of course they are, yeah. And they will be, hauled up if they're not. So they have to be very careful, as of course all the free-to-air channels do. I mean, BBC 2, Channel 4, Channel 5, have the same issues. Aren't you being a bit precious, worrying about being called far right? I mean, if you were called an extremist, in the same company as Tommy Robinson and that crowd, then you'd have a point.
Tommy Robinson is not in the building, and he would argue that he's not extreme.
What's so objectionable about being called
far right?
right?
Means extremist.
I mean, you're further right than the Tory party. I mean, you'd accept that? So
well,
if further's OK, what's wrong with far?
But people associate that sort of far-right label with Nazis, with thugs, with extremists, with the National Front.
The Tommy Robinson crowd are the only thing we have in Britain which is remotely on that kind of extreme fringe, and clearly you're not in that group.
I'm just looking at Christine now. You're dying to chip
Well,
in
it's
there.
not difficult to be further right than the current Tory party, is it?
I mean, it's pretty Lib Dem, frankly. That's their problem, and that's why...
Is Lib Dem a bad thing, Christine?
It's not a bad thing, but it's not what a Tory government should be. That's the problem. That's why they're going to lose the election, because they haven't been Conservative, which is why Reform are doing so well.
True, but you see people like, some of the media personalities on the BBC, like Gary Lineker, is always tweeting a load of nonsense out on his social media platform. So it sort of begs the question: can the BBC be unbiased?
Well, I mean, OK, Gary Lineker's in one place. I mean, they used to have Clarkson on for years, who was the opposite, and it was great fun, and it was part of a mix, right? And,
he wasn't doing politics, though, was he? Forgive me if he was, but I don't think he was.
In the politics space, you've got people like Andrew Neil, who was a brilliant journalist, a very good interviewer, but, very clearly positioned on the right, and not apologetic about it. So, quite what's the problem?
Well, one of my main problems with the BBC is if you complain about any other broadcaster, whether it's GB News or ITV or anything, you go to Ofcom. If you want to complain about the BBC, where do you go? The BBC. It is utterly ridiculous. Why is it only the BBC that's allowed to mark its own homework?
Well, I think you probably could go to Ofcom, couldn't you?
You have to go to the BBC first. Do you remember recently there was that Newsnight programme discussing GB News, and there wasn't a single person on the programme who, even in a mild way, was defending GB News. It was all vicious attack. And I, along with many other people, complained about that to the BBC, and you just get a bland...
Some of my friends, Christine, actually still watch Question Time on a Thursday night, and they say it's always a balanced audience. Right. Well, they're supposed to select a balanced audience of voters from all political spectrums, but it never seems very balanced when they get the reactions from people in the audience.
Well, the Beeb's defence is, whether it's that or anything else, they say that they get as many complaints from the left as they do from the right, so therefore they must be balanced because they're doing something right.
I think actually I've been on Question Time 20 times or something like that, and sometimes you get a very, very hard time from the audience and the other panellists, and the BBC are actually meticulous on that particular programme. I mean, there may be other things that you've got problems with, but I mean, picking out Question Time as a biased programme, I mean, I don't buy that.
I don't watch it, so I can't comment about Question Time. Why would I want to watch Question Time?
I mean, it does seem, Christine, and it works both ways, I guess, sometimes, because we saw when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, he had a terrible time, didn't he, from most of the media. And then Boris got the same back in 2019. So they have a big role to play, the BBC and all the channels.
Well, and of course the big difference with the BBC is that we pay for it. I mean, GB News is 100% funded privately. Through advertising as well, but no element of compulsion, whereas we all have to pay for the BBC. Therefore, there is a double duty on them to be impartial because they're paid for by the whole country.
But they should be impartial. Why is it they refuse to label Hamas as a terrorist organisation?
Well, they do. I mean, every news bulletin.
No,
they use this phrase about a government described. Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, the Middle East is a highly emotive issue. People are throwing around words like terrorist, genocide, whether or not it has any precise legal justification. So it is a tricky area. They're going to run into problems whatever they do. And I've always got a sense that they're very careful on their news bulletins always to have a Palestinian voice and a voice from the Israeli authorities. Yeah. And they're very careful to keep a balance between the two.
But Vince says they're going to run into trouble. But with who? With who, Christine? They're answerable to you, like the taxpayer.
Well, exactly, and they're answerable to themselves. But how you can possibly say after the 7th of October that Hamas is not a terrorist organisation is simply unbelievable.
No, of course. Well, I think we completely buy that.
But it took them a while to realise that, didn't it? And actually to follow through and call them terrorist.
Yeah. Let's talk about the election coming up this year.
Oh, do let's.
Yeah, let's talk about the election. We've seen the emergence of the Reform Party. I mean, polling quite well this week.
Congratulations, by the way.
That's not down to
being
me,
their
Christine.
first MP. Well, you are their first MP, which is a great
no, not quite right. Farage's lot had an MP, didn't they?
Yeah, but not the Reform Party.
Well, it was called something else.
Yeah, I have got that honour of being the first Reform member.
You'll go in the history books as the first ever Reform MP.
Yes.
Maybe the last, of course, but certainly first.
So, let's talk about the election. Is Reform going to win some seats, you think, in the next election?
It's an uphill struggle, isn't it, for any small party, as we know. I mean, the system is very unfair. If you are part of the major parties, Labour or Tory, you love the system because it keeps one of you in power forever. If you're one of the minor parties, then it's desperately unfair. Of course it's unfair. I mean, I can't remember the figures, but UKIP got millions and millions and millions of votes at the last election or the election before, and they got no MPs. They got one. I think Douglas Carswell.
I think people now, Vince, are a little bit smarter, a bit more nimble how they vote. You know, people sometimes vote for the party or against the party that they don't want to be elected. But I think this time, the electorate, there's the sort of sense that I'm getting travelling up and down the country is the electorate a little bit fed up with politics, and a lot will stay at home and not vote to apathy. That could be a big killer at the election. And people, especially on the subject of immigration, which we spoke about earlier, people just think they've been let down for well over 20 years now on immigration.
They've been lied to.
I think one thing we're all agreed on, actually, is that the British voting system is extremely unfair to small and insurgent parties. I mean, I know very well from the last 40 years or so. And the system works heavily against you. I mean, you may well get 1 or 2 MPs. I mean, I guess you have a reasonable chance. But you know, the system is not going to give you a big representation in Parliament. No. We're throwing the kitchen sink at the next election. We may get 30, 35, something like that. But it still would be very
unrepresentative. Too many buses then, Vince, right?
We're very unrepresentative, our support in the country.
Two points. One is I personally think Reform is making a mistake fighting every single seat. I think it's ridiculous to fight certain people who share virtually every single view. I think it's a waste of resources and you should be homing in on others. That's the first point. Second point is actually if you look at Wales, and I don't hold Wales out as an example of anything, frankly, having
well, you're a poor example for health and education.
Well, exactly. Having worked there for 5 years, I've seen it on the inside. But their electoral system does have an element of fairness because they have 60 members and 40 of them are elected on the constituency basis, and then the other 20 are done on a variation of proportional
representation. Well, the Welsh, the Scottish, the London voting system is proportional, and it does give a fairer representation.
Before we move on to the yes or no quiz, I'd like to read out a statement provided to us by the BBC on the BBC refusing to use the word terrorist to describe Hamas. It said, the BBC uses the word terrorist with attribution. When we mention Hamas, we make it clear where possible that they are a prescribed terrorist organisation by the UK government and others. And in response to our concern about its employees tweeting politically motivated materials, it said, high-profile presenters outside of journalism should be able to express views on issues and policies, including matters of political contention, but stop well short of campaigning in party politics or for activist organisations. It is clear that the British public expect BBC non-news presenters to maintain high standards on social media and respect an appropriate balance between impartiality and freedom of expression.
It's the yes/no quiz,
right.
And remember Stephen Pound. He comes on the show on a regular basis. He's not what you want to be like. You need to just answer yes or no.
Okay.
I know it's difficult for politicians. So I'll start with you, Vince. Will Trump win the US election?
Yes, I think he will.
Yes.
A wrong answer, because you said yes, I think he will. So I can't give you that. That's 1-0.
Hang on, he said yes, didn't he?
Yeah, but it says I think he will.
Oh, I see. It's that
yes
strict.
or no. It's a
crumbs.
very strict quiz, Christine.
Okay.
So go to you. Will Biden be the Democratic candidate in the election?
No.
Vince?
Yes.
So, Vince, is Reform UK a far-right party as described by the BBC who later apologised?
Yes.
It's far-right, isn't it, Christine?
No.
Number 4, Christine, will Labour win the next election?
Yes.
Vince?
Yes.
And last question, Vince, will Reform win any seats at the next election?
Yes.
Christine?
Yes.
5-4 to Christine. Is there one you want to come back on, Christine, to explain your answer?
My yes on the last question about will reform, I was hesitant because, you know, the system is massively stacked against you.
Yeah. But there is a groundswell, I feel, of public opinion at the moment who are just fed up with We see Labour like 20-odd points behind. I don't think that's because they are literally 20 points behind. I think a lot of people don't want to vote. Or
well, they need to be 12 points ahead to win the election.
Yeah.
So actually 20 could evaporate quite quickly.
And a lot of people, I'm sure, haven't made up their mind yet. They're keeping their powder dry.
So is the one you want to come back on, Vince, one of these questions?
No, I mean, I think you diddled me out of a point.
No, you've got to be strict in this show. On this quiz, it's a yes or no. Yeah, you've done it before, but let's just talk about Labour winning the next election. Is it going to be a landslide, or is it going to be a hung parliament? I don't see the landslide coming personally.
No, I don't either. I think they will probably get back with a small overall majority, but of course they've still got a rump of 20 or 30 Corbynites. Starmer's going to have a problem maintaining discipline in his party. Things are going to be tough. There's not a great deal they can do with the budget position and the debt position.
And will they get any beef from the unions, the public service unions?
I think people are going to think long and hard, those that bother to vote. And I want to see how people can not vote if you look back at the history of how people have fought and died to get the vote. But there we are. I don't think it's going to be a massive landslide, but I do think they'll do it pretty easily, I'm afraid.
And do you think my old party will change the leader before the election, Vince?
No.
Christine?
Absolutely not, for goodness sake. 5, I mean, is it 5 or 6, 7? I don't know, it's 5.
I don't know,
it's absurd. It's absurd. Can we just go back to the Biden business?
Yeah.
Because I'm certain that what's going to happen once he's got the nomination, he's suddenly going to be discovered that he's too ill to stand when it's safe.
But we know that already, don't we?
Well, of course we do, but if they admit it now, then you get Kamala Harris, and they don't want that. So they've got to get over that.
OK, guys, we're going to wrap it up now. Sorry, Vince, you got defeated by Christine, 5 points to 4. You're the winner this week on the yes-no quiz.
Well, I need to win because you've got beer and I've got water.
Well, actually, it's gin, and it's neat as well.
Gin.
So, coming up next, we've got YouTube sensation Pearl Davis.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Could we talk about opening up the new Bond role to someone, Alex? And,
yes.
This is an actor called Aaron Taylor Johnson.
Right. Do you remember when the director of the 50 Shades of Grey films had a young boyfriend, really young, like half her age? It was in all the papers at the time. Well, it turns out that was him.
He broke his career, I think, in a film called Kick-Ass, which was... I watched it, really great film.
You can't compare... What's his name? Who's the last Bond?
Daniel Craig.
Daniel Craig.
To Roger... But you can't compare Roger Moore to Sean Connery either.
No.
Who's your favourite Bond? My favourite Bond is Pierce Brosnan, probably.
Same.
Really?
Oh, come on, yes.
Sean Connery, maybe
So the classics.
Yeah.
I'm quite keen on Roger Moore, but I quite like the kind of the ironic raise of the eyebrow and all that.
Well, interesting, this sort of puts to death all of those rumours that James Bond was going to be a woman, James Bond was going to be a black man. There was lots of different rumours going around of what they were going to do with his
Idris
role.
Elba would be good.
He hasn't signed yet.
As a feminist, I would say James Bond shouldn't be a woman.
I totally agree.
Because we need to have our own stories that we tell and our own heroes. We don't need to kind of go in on that. We just need to have a story that celebrates a woman, I think.
I agree. Who was your favourite, Eamon?
So I do think if you look at them all, there's not a bad one amongst them. But personally, I got to know Roger Moore, and an absolute gentleman and a man who was a star in every sense of the word, and a possibly handsome-looking man. Pierce, I think Pierce, very good, and Pierce again is a very likeable fella, very likeable. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, that the appetite, I think, for James Bond is still there, but they are reinventing it. And the fact that they change it and kind of go with the time. I thought Daniel Craig was very good, actually.
I just struggled with Daniel Craig the most because I just couldn't cope with blonde Bond. So the idea of a female Bond or, I
anything else,
cope with Daniel Craig, so...
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to Lee Anderson's Real World, and tonight I'm joined by social media sensation Pearl Davis. Pearl, I've got some notes here, a little bit of background about you, and I'm going to be honest with you, it's not a good look.
Oh, okay.
It says you've been described as misogynistic, anti-feminist, the female Andrew Tate, and you believe, you wrote on Twitter, I think, in 2023, that women should not have the vote. Should they be chained up at the kitchen sink?
Well, I didn't say chained up at the kitchen sink. I just said we shouldn't vote.
Why shouldn't they vote?
Look, I think you need to have some skin in the game, right? Women, right now, we're not doing any of the infrastructure jobs, not at large. We're not paying taxes, we're in a loaded debt, and we keep voting for policies that ruin the country. So I just look at large and I think to myself, why do we deserve to vote? Are we paying taxes? No. Are we doing the hard jobs? No. If you just limited it to people that pay taxes, are not in debt, are not taking child support, alimony, or any of that stuff, it would be like 2 women that could vote left or that do infrastructure.
You know, if I said this sort of stuff, Pearl, I would get chased. There would be people out with pitchforks chasing me down the street. Do you get much, kickback on this?
Well, it's true, though. You know, it's true. And it's so funny because when I talk to guys, I know they agree with me deep down. I know they see you're laughing because I'm right. And see, because you wouldn't find this funny if you didn't know that it was true on some level.
But you say,
I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair that we have all of the say. All of the politicians have to cater to us, because we are the largest swing vote.
I can see what you're saying to a small extent. I've always said that men get a rough deal sometimes. Men are pretty useful when it comes to going to war. They're pretty useful when it comes to going down a coal mine and digging coal out. They're pretty useful when it goes to going into the ocean, fishing, and doing all the dangerous, nasty, horrible jobs in construction, etc. But women are just as important because without women, we wouldn't have children.
Yeah, I mean, but that doesn't mean you should vote because without men we wouldn't have children either.
Surely women want a better world.
Why is it that we only give women credit for the children? No kids.
So
kids.
maybe one day when if you do have children, you might want to think to yourself.
Crazy. You know what I just realized? I'm sorry. We're not even doing that.
What?
We're not having kids.
Why?
So you said without women we wouldn't have children. We're not having children. The birth rate's decline. It's like one of the biggest problems in every country.
Yes, but it's important as a mother when you do have children. One of the first things that you think about as any parent, really, whether you're male or female, is what sort of world do you want your children to live in? And you can only influence that world by the ballot box, surely.
Yes, so. But again, I think you need to have skin in the game. I think you need to be paying taxes. I'm not for men.
So you're saying that unemployed people shouldn't?
No. I think you need to have some skin in the game.
Yeah.
I don't think it's fair. And on top of that, in the U.S., men are fined $250,000 if they're not enlisted in selective service.
Okay.
That's why women didn't vote historically. It wasn't what they tell you, all this oppression, sexism. No, it was because the vote came with going to war in times of trouble. So now it's like men have all of the responsibility of running society, protecting society.
Okay, so what about?
So that came with the freedom to vote. And
so I guess there's people like watching this now, screaming at the screen. So what about female politicians? We've had female prime ministers. Should they be allowed to enter politics?
Oh God, women? I don't prefer women in politics. I don't prefer it. But if they're tax-paying citizens, fine.
So how can a female politician, we've had a few female prime ministers in this country, but you're saying they shouldn't be allowed to vote?
I'm not the biggest fan of female politicians. I think generally we're too emotional.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like, do I want, in the U.S., I know more about the U.S. political system.
Yep.
So do I want someone with the nuke bomb that could get their period? And then she's in a bad mood. I don't want that personally.
Yeah, I suppose it'd be.
I fear the day we have a woman president in the U.S. I fear that day.
Why?
I don't think women aren't meant to lead. We're not meant to lead countries.
You're being a bit. If I said that about women having periods and about to press the nuclear button, I'd be in a whole lot of trouble. But men have bad moods as well. We've seen some people in the world that are leading countries. Look at Putin. Most people think that he's a madman. Would you sooner have him running the country with his finger on a button or a sensible lady?
Well, I can't speak to Putin, but, you know, in my experience, women are far less emotionally stable than men. I've interviewed 1,000 women, and I could tell a significant difference. And I think if you ask the average person on the street who's more emotionally stable, men or women.
Can you imagine the kind of backlash I would get, or any man would get, saying what you're saying?
I know, but you guys know I'm right. That's the funny thing. You guys all know I'm right.
YouTube, you got what? Millions of subscribers. What sort of feedback do you get from that, Pearl? You know, with these sort of ideas and theories you've got.
Some people like it, some people hate it.
Yeah, and is there a market for it?
Is there a market?
Market for it? Yeah, obviously there is, isn't there?
Oh gosh, no. I don't even think women shouldn't vote is the most popular opinion. I would say my stuff more focuses around family court. That's actually how I came to the conclusion that women shouldn't vote, was because, look, I wanted to know why men didn't have access to their children in this country.
Yeah.
And I find out that all the politicians are catering to the women, even though men are doing the majority of the work. That's not fair to me.
I think that there is some truth in what you say there about, you know, in relationship breakdowns, etc. When there's children involved, sometimes the law sort of, you know, is on the side of the women.
90% of the time.
Yeah, I know, I've been there. I was fortunate enough though when my relationship broke down. I was fortunate enough to have my children come and stay with me. So not always, you know, if sometimes you have to put a little bit of a fight up. But your opinions would be crazy to probably millions of people, but you know, some people might agree with you. I don't agree with you, but that's fine. We live in a democratic world. I think people like my mother and my sisters and the women I know would be going crazy at you saying they shouldn't have a vote. But I respect your right to have that opinion. Coming up next, we've got Friday Night Live. I just want to say a big thank you to all my guests this week, and I'm sure there's plenty of people will be emailing in complaining about this lady saying you can't have a vote.
Cheers, Lee. Cracking show, and also one coming up. Me, Ben Leo, in for Mark Dolan tonight. He's out on the town. I have a special Easter message for you. I know Christianity's a bit of a dirty word in recent weeks, gesture eggs and all that kind of nonsense, but stick with me. I've got a message that's guaranteed to warm your cockles. Friday Night Live with me, Ben Leo. Stay with us in just a tick.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio, and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast on the Met. As we go through the rest of this Easter weekend, for most of us we've continued to see the mix of some sunshine but also the risk of some rain at